Something happened in Mexico City last week. A handshake, a private meeting, no press, no cameras, just two leaders. And when they walked out, the trade map of North America had already been redrawn. The United States wasn't in the room, Trump wasn't consulted, and by the time Washington realized what happened, it was already too late. This is not about tariffs. This is not about border disputes. This is about two countries looking at the largest economy in the world and deciding they no longer need it. Canada and Mexico just signed a framework agreement. Bilateral trade, direct corridors, no American intermediaries required. USMCA still exists on paper, but the system it was supposed to lock in place is fracturing, and Trump's name is on the cracks. Let's go back. USMCA was signed in 2020. Trump called it the greatest trade deal in history. He said it replaced NAFTA. He said it locked Canada and Mexico into American terms forever. The United States would sit at the center. Canada and Mexico would orbit around American demands. Any trade between the two would require American infrastructure, American ports, American rails, American approval. But leverage only works if the other side has no alternatives. And Trump just spent the last year giving them alternatives. Tariff threats, sovereignty insults, annexation rhetoric, public humiliation. Canada and Mexico didn't respond with anger. They responded with strategy. The meeting in Mexico City wasn't announced in advance. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum. They met privately, no joint statement afterward, no press conference, just a brief acknowledgement that discussions took place, and then silence. That silence should have been a warning, because when leaders meet quietly and say nothing, it means something is already in motion. 3 days later, a document surfaced, not a full treaty, a framework, Canada-Mexico Strategic Trade Partnership. The language was careful, complementary to existing agreements, designed to enhance bilateral cooperation. But buried in the framework was the real message: direct trade corridors between Canada and Mexico, energy partnerships that bypass U.S. infrastructure, agricultural agreements that redirect supply chains, critical mineral cooperation that excludes American buyers, and a clause about dispute resolution. Any disagreement between Canada and Mexico would be resolved bilaterally. No third-party involvement, no American arbitration. This is where things stop making sense. USMCA is supposed to be the governing framework for North American trade. It has enforcement mechanisms. It requires all three countries to coordinate on major trade decisions. But if Canada and Mexico build a parallel system, USMCA becomes optional. They can comply with the agreement when it benefits them, and bypass it when it doesn't. The United States can't stop them, because the framework isn't a violation of USMCA. It's just an additional layer, a layer the United States isn't part of. Let's look at what this actually means. Start with energy. Mexico imports approximately 6 billion cubic feet of natural gas per day from the United States. That gas powers Mexican industry. Without it, Mexico's economy would face serious disruption. That dependency gave Washington leverage. Canada exports electricity to the United States. But Canada also exports natural gas, and that gas could go somewhere else. The new framework includes an energy corridor, Canadian natural gas to Mexico, not through American pipelines, direct infrastructure. The framework authorizes feasibility studies. It commits both countries to exploring pipeline construction, Mexican refineries that could process Canadian crude, Canadian LNG terminals that could serve Mexican buyers. The infrastructure doesn't exist yet, but the framework gives it legal backing. And once it's built, the dependency shifts. Mexico no longer needs American natural gas as desperately. Canada no longer needs American buyers as exclusively. The leverage Washington assumed was permanent starts eroding. Now look at agriculture. Canada produces wheat, canola, potash. Mexico produces avocados, tomatoes, citrus. Both countries have historically traded with the United States as a primary partner. But the framework includes agricultural diversification. Canadian wheat to Mexican buyers, Mexican produce to Canadian markets, direct logistics, no American ports, no American inspection delays, no American tariff uncertainty. This doesn't eliminate U.S.-Canada or U.S.-Mexico agricultural trade, but it creates alternatives, and alternatives mean options. Canadian farmers who used to export grain through American Gulf Coast ports can now ship directly to Mexico. Mexican producers who sold to American distributors can now sell directly to Canadian retailers. The margins improve. The uncertainty decreases. And once those relationships are established, they persist. Then there's manufacturing. USMCA was designed to keep automotive and industrial supply chains integrated. Parts made in Mexico, assembled in the United States, exported through Canadian ports. The whole system was built around American centrality. But the framework includes manufacturing coordination, Canadian steel to Mexican factories, Mexican automotive components to Canadian assembly plants, products exported to Asia and Europe without touching U.S. soil. Again, the infrastructure isn't fully in place, but the intent is clear. reduce reliance on American supply chain nodes, build direct Mexico-Canada production networks, and once companies start using those networks, they don't switch back. Because switching is expensive, it requires retooling, it requires new contracts. Companies don't do that unless they have to. So once the bilateral supply chains are operational, they become the default. And American manufacturing nodes that used to be indispensable become optional. Here's what makes this move so effective. Canada and Mexico aren't announcing a dramatic break. They're not threatening the United States. They're simply building alternatives, quietly, methodically. And by the time those alternatives are operational, USMCA will still exist. But it will govern a trade system that no longer runs through the United States as the mandatory hub. The United States will still trade with Canada, it will still trade with Mexico, but it won't be the center anymore. It will be one of 3 nodes, and in a 3-node system where 2 nodes are directly connected, the 3rd node loses control. Trump's response so far has been predictable. He called the framework a betrayal. He threatened new tariffs on both countries. He suggested the United States might withdraw from USMCA entirely. But here's the problem. Withdrawing from USMCA doesn't stop the Canada-Mexico framework. It just accelerates it. And threatening tariffs? Canada and Mexico are already building trade routes that reduce exposure to American tariffs. That's the entire point of the framework. Every Trump threat makes the alternative system more attractive. Every insult reinforces the decision to reduce dependence. Trump is trying to stop the framework by doing more of what caused it in the first place. Let's talk about what this means for American businesses. U.S. exporters to Mexico face new competition from Canadian suppliers. U.S. importers from Canada face potential redirection to Mexican buyers. American logistics companies lose transit fees as Canada-Mexico corridors expand. Railway operators who moved Canadian grain through U.S. ports lose volume. U.S. ports lose volume as bilateral shipping increases. Seattle and Tacoma lose Canadian grain exports. Houston and New Orleans lose Mexican energy imports. This doesn't happen overnight, but it doesn't need to. Trade routes shift gradually, a few contracts redirected here, a new supplier relationship there, and within 5 years, the trade flows that seemed permanent have restructured around the United States instead of through it. Here's where it gets worse. Other countries are watching. If Canada and Mexico can successfully reduce dependence on the United States, what's stopping others? The European Union sees a model for dealing with American trade unpredictability. Build bilateral frameworks that don't require U.S. participation. Asian economies see a template for regional cooperation that excludes American veto power. Latin American countries see proof that aligning against U.S. pressure can work. Trump thought economic size meant permanent leverage. He's watching 2 smaller economies demonstrate that size doesn't matter if the smaller economies coordinate. Now, let's talk about what Washington didn't see coming. For decades, U.S. trade policy operated on an assumption. Canada and Mexico might disagree with American demands, but they would never seriously coordinate against the United States. Geography made cooperation difficult. Political differences made alignment unlikely. And both countries needed American markets too much to risk confrontation. That assumption just collapsed. Canada and Mexico looked at Trump's trade chaos and reached the same conclusion. Relying on the United States is too risky. They didn't need to like each other. They just needed a shared interest in reducing dependence on American unpredictability. And Trump gave them that interest. The framework includes something else, a clause about future expansion. Other countries can join, not as full members, but as partners in specific sectors: energy, agriculture, critical minerals. This isn't just Canada and Mexico. This is the beginning of a North American trade network that doesn't center on the United States. Chile has already expressed interest in joining the critical minerals component. Colombia is exploring agricultural coordination. Central American countries are watching to see if the framework succeeds. If it does, the United States faces a Western Hemisphere trade bloc that it doesn't control and can't veto. Here's what Trump doesn't understand. Trade relationships aren't just about tariffs and market access. They're about trust, predictability, the belief that agreements will be honored, that rules won't change arbitrarily, that partnerships are built on mutual benefit, not domination. Trump spent a year destroying that trust, threatening Canada with annexation, threatening Mexico with military action, imposing tariffs without warning, treating allies like subordinates. And Canada and Mexico responded by building a system where American trust is no longer required. So where does this go? The framework is just a framework. Turning it into operational infrastructure takes time, but the timeline is accelerating. Canadian and Mexican officials are meeting monthly, working groups, technical committees, trade delegations identifying priority corridors. Private companies are exploring investment in bilateral logistics. Within 2 years, the first major Canada-Mexico direct supply chains will be operational. A natural gas pipeline from Western Canada to northern Mexico. A direct agricultural shipping route from Saskatchewan to Mexico City. A manufacturing supply chain linking Ontario to Mexican assembly plants. Within 5 years, those supply chains will handle billions in trade. And the United States will be watching from the outside, still part of USMCA, still trading with both countries, but no longer the indispensable hub that everything flows through. Here's the final piece. This didn't have to happen. Canada and Mexico didn't want to reduce dependence on the United States. It was risky. It required significant investment. It meant restructuring supply chains that had worked for decades. But Trump made it necessary. Every tariff threat, every sovereignty insult, every unpredictable policy shift, each one reinforced the same lesson. The United States cannot be trusted as a reliable partner. And once that trust is gone, it doesn't come back just because the political leadership changes. Because the lesson isn't about Trump. The lesson is about the system. If one American president can threaten this aggressively, what's to stop the next one? Dependence on American goodwill is a strategic vulnerability, and strategic vulnerabilities need to be eliminated. The Canada-Mexico framework isn't just about trade, it's about what happens when pressure backfires, when threats create the very outcome they were supposed to prevent. When the largest economy in the world discovers that size doesn't guarantee control, Trump wanted to dominate North American trade. Instead, he created a North American trade system that no longer needs him. USMCA still exists, but the system it governs is fragmenting. And by the time Washington realizes the full implications, the alternatives will already be operational. Canada and Mexico didn't make a dramatic announcement. They didn't declare independence. They just quietly built a future where American approval is optional. And if that's not the end of USMCA, it's the beginning of its irrelevance. The meeting in Mexico City lasted 3 hours. No cameras, no press, just 2 leaders and a framework that changes everything. By the time Trump found out, the document was already signed, and the system he thought he controlled had already started shifting. This is not about what might happen. This is about what is happening. Right now, quietly. Canada and Mexico building a trade architecture that doesn't include the United States, not because they want to exclude America, but because America made itself unreliable. And unreliable partners get replaced. By the time it's too late to stop, it will already be too late to matter.